It is wonderful to welcome Will Kingston to this podcast. He hosts of the Australiana podcast, hosted by the Spectator Australia. Well, welcome to the show. How are you?
G'day, Chung. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I should first like to begin by asking you about your professional background and how you end up being an employee of the Spectator Australia.
So my day job, I suppose, the job that uh, kind of or my full-time job is in management consulting. Uh, but I've always had a passion for politics, for current affairs, and for ideas. I was a schoolboy debating nerd back in the day, and I've always loved debate and argument and being able to be involved in the contest of ideas in some way. And I think that's something which I wanted to find an outlet to be able to express. And so I reached out to the Spectator Australia about 18 months ago now and suggested that we start a podcast which was focused on both Australian politics and culture, but I think more generally about culture in Western civilization today, some of the cultural battlegrounds that the West is seeing emerge, uh, and then how do those cultural battlegrounds uh, interact with history, uh, and I guess some other disciplines. And the outcome of that is basically I get to speak to interesting people every week, and it's a great privilege. I also now am on Sky News in Australia every week, where I get to chat about politics. So I would not call myself a journalist. I'd probably call myself a conversationalist. But it is a great privilege being able to discuss and debate ideas, because I think in our society today it's a great shame that debate is perhaps not uh, as it's perhaps looked down upon, whereas in a way in the past it used to actually be encouraged.
Um, Couldn't agree more. So I actually discovered the Australiana podcast because of Instagram. I noticed that the account associated with the podcast follow my own account, which is a private account. So I don't do any posting on there. So I was glad to discover a new podcast, and I also discovered to my pleasant surprise that I have an audience in Australia, a country that I've only visited once. Before this show even was conceived. So yeah, glad we got a chance to connect. My next question would be, what kind of conversation do you hope to have? I always suppose that the conversations that you and I facilitate on our respective podcasts are the kinds of conversations that we hope to have in real life, which the conditions are may not be favorable. So, what kind of conversations would you like to have, like in the real world, in regards to political matters?
I think there has to be a fundamental principle that underpins all of the conversations that we have. And that is, conversation should ultimately be a search for truth. I think that's a lesson which perhaps has been forgotten in today's society. I think there are so many things or modern phenomena that I think are preventing us from that search for truth. Identity politics is a good example of a modern cultural phenomena which, in my view, obfuscates truth. Now, sometimes truth can be unpleasant, sometimes it can be unpalatable, but I still think that the search for truth should underpin every conversation we have. Now, what does that mean? It means a couple of things. It means, A, you need to prioritize freedom of speech and individual liberties more generally. in order to be able to find that. You cannot have a search for truth if you don't prioritize freedom of speech. I think freedom of speech is under a sustained assault across the Western world today. And I spoke to Douglas Murray only a couple of weeks ago. He made the good point that unfortunately, many, if not most people, probably prioritize security and safety and just things moving forward and moving along over individual freedoms and freedom of speech. So I think the people who are passionate about that and who do understand that every great civilization, and indeed Western civilization, is built on the bedrock of freedom of speech, need to really argue very vociferously for that. The other thing that I would say, and this is tied to freedom of speech, is that conversations that search for truth can often involve very dangerous ideas. Now, there is this instinct amongst some people in the media classes to protect people from what they see as something which is dangerous. You see this with, say, how Donald Trump is reported by some news stations. If he says something which is inflammatory, there'll be some stations that say, we're not going to broadcast his statements. We're not going to give him a platform. And the underlying thing that annoys me there is it basically takes the viewer for an idiot. It says, we can't trust you with this sort of information for you to make your own mind up, to think critically about this. So I think we need to get more comfortable as a Western society with having conversations that search for truth. And you're only going to get that if you support free speech and if you're comfortable with having dangerous ideas in the public discourse that can be considered.
I see. That's a wonderful answer. Now, recently I finished reading Infidel, the book by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a memoir. I mean, obviously, aside from just a remarkable tale of her life, it also breaches that one of the dangerous topics in which much of the Western political class has not been courageous enough to breach, which is the influence of political Islam or Islamism in Western society. Of course, neither you and I are of the Muslim religion. I think we both hopefully advocate for the tolerance of the Muslim Islamic faith, but at the same time, we have to deal with the fact that there is an interpretation of the Islamic religion that is hostile to the values that we share, namely freedom of speech and tolerance, amongst other values. So, given that as an example, what do you suppose are some of the quote unquote taboo topics of, well, Australian politics in particular and Western politics in general that you believe there should be more substantive conversations about?
Well, Islam is certainly right up there, and that is the same. So I think as a prefacing comment, Australia, well, Australia is in lockstep, give or take, with some of these trends that we're seeing across the Anglosphere. Unfortunately, a lot of this stuff starts in America and then gets transported or exported, I should say, to the rest of the world, particularly to the UK, to much of Europe, and to Australia. I don't think Australia is by any means as bad as, say, the US when it comes to some of the worse elements of, say, identity politics, race relations, but you can tell that we're exporting a lot of that. So just to answer your question, I think Islam is right up there. If you recall back in the early 2000s, we actually had reached a point in society where we were quite comfortable having debates about religion and debates about Islam specifically. So the New Atheists, Hitchens, Christopher Dawkins, they were very, very forthright in their views about Islam. I don't think you could have those same conversations today because there is, to your point, this taboo feeling. And I think one of the big problems here is that this conversation around Islam gets tied up with race in a way that it shouldn't. Islam is an ideology. An ideology, by definition, is something that you can choose to believe in or not believe in. In my opinion, that means it should be open to criticism. It should be open, even to ridicule. Uh, but unfortunately, there are people who quite willfully say that if you oppose particular elements of Islam, you are a racist, which is ridiculous. It's nonsensical. But because race now, particularly in America, but anywhere, there is no greater social insult. There's no greater tarring of anyone's name than to be called a racist in today's day and age. So as a result of that, if you are slandered as a racist, you're afraid of having conversations. This is a way of stifling debate in society. And so uh, I think it's very unfortunate. I think we should have these sorts of open conversations about Islam. I think the other ones, to go back to the question of what are the other kind of taboo topics, anything around identity now is difficult. I think fortunate, and again, this is a Western trend as much as an Australian trend. The trans debate is a good example. But interestingly, because of the courage of a relatively small group of people, I think you're now starting to see a turn in the trans debate. There is now more of an acceptance to say, for example, that the conversion of children, the transitioning of children, I should say, is barbaric, is evil, is wrong. Whereas I think 3 or 4 years ago, you couldn't say that in polite society. So I think it goes to show that these things can turn if people have the courage in their convictions and advocate for a position in a common sense way. Um, Islam, identity, they're the big cultural taboos of our time, but I think we need to be getting those out in the open and discussing them.
Mhm. Okay. So just to touch on the topic of the Islamic faith a little bit. So I understand that you're based in New York, New
Yes,
York
that's right.
City. But during in the country that is close to I suppose your home country of Australia, New Zealand, back
Mm,
in 2019, there was a horrific shooting and in Christchurch, and the the perpetrator specifically targeted Muslims for
mm,
his like bloodlust, so to speak. Um, and and I guess in that way, the bigotry that some people have against Muslims are real. But at the same time, I think the characterization of Islamophobia, so to speak, I think that is a conversation stopper here and there. Um, it it blurs this demarcation between Islam, which is a faith and the bedrock of I guess Ottoman and then Middle Eastern civilization, and Islamism, uh, a modern, very aggressive ideology that motivates a sense of intolerance against the non-Muslim other. And I recently I wrote a piece in my Substack page reflecting on the slaying of two very prominent Dutchmen back in the early 2000s when Percy Ali wrote her book. One is Theo van Gogh, her friend and companion who made the film with her, Submission. And the other is the Dutch politician. I'm going to butcher his pronunciation, but Pim Fortuyn, who it's left-wing gay man. He spoke out against the infiltration of Islamism in his home country. Um, Due to personal reasons too, he saw very clearly that the the Islamists he encountered did not tolerate gay people at all, and he was killed by a far left activist uh, because of what he said. So the the topic of Islam in the West is, I guess, there's a certain intensity to it because on the one hand you have certain people who are genuinely bigoted against Muslims, and on the other, um, I guess, politically correct ideologues who use this phrase Islamophobia to shut down any form of dialogue in regards to a dangerous ideology claiming the mantle of Muhammad the Prophet. So I'll pass it on to you.
So bigotry in all its forms is wrong. The actions that you mentioned in New Zealand were an unspeakable evil. Bigotry against people with red hair, fat people, you name it. It's all wrong, right? And no, I don't think anyone can say otherwise. What I would challenge is what I see as a false equivalency. And by that, I mean, I think that a lot of politicians, largely because they're afraid both of the very real physical threats that come from Islamic extremism, as well as a cowardice for being called a racist, basically say, well, you know what? The threat from Islamic extremism is the same as, say, the threat from far right nationalism.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that they're not both legitimate things to be concerned about, but all the data would suggest that there is one threat which is much greater than the other. But nonetheless, you have leaders like Rishi Sunak very recently. You have leaders like Joe Biden. In fact, pretty much every Western leader, you notice this. Whenever the conversation around Islamic extremism comes up, in the same breath, they feel like they've got to, like a counterweight, say, throw out far right nationalism. Now, what that does is it really just seems to cloud an issue which I think needs to be brought out into the light to a much greater degree. I don't think it does any favors to the vast majority of moderate Muslims who live their lives in peace. Uh, but I have a bit of an issue with the false equivalence in terms of the scale of the threat between, say, Islamic extremism and other extremist groups, because I don't think they're particularly comparable in Western democracies.
Um, so I think jumping off of the your point regarding false equivalence or equivocation, the resurgence of the discussion around Islamism, particularly in Britain, comes in the wake of the horrific attack on Israeli soil by Hamas.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
one of the rather egregious acts of false equivalency that I witness is Western leaders. Again, I'm thinking about certain figures in America and Britain, and I suppose some from Australia too, who,
Mm.
aside from condemning anti-Semitism, they have to add it with Islamophobia as well. And for that, I think Justin Trudeau and his government of Canada is particularly guilty of this. And I've seen like multiple stories in CBC, their nationally funded network, that um, talks about the rise in quote unquote Islamophobia in Canada following October the 7th. And there are multiple subjects of irritation that I can see in the dialogue about what happened after October the 7th and Israel's alleged moral culpability in it. But so I'd like to pass this to you. What do you believe should happen if a conversation like featuring like non-Israeli, non-Arab people regarding this conflict, what steps should we take in order to have a healthy civil discussion regarding it?
So for starters, I think the word Islamophobia was being thrown out from October 8th before there was even any demonstrable examples of Islamophobia. And I don't think there's actually been many demonstrable examples of Islamophobia. There were people who were crying out, we need to be concerned about Islamophobia. This is despite the fact that they didn't say we need to be concerned about the rape, torture, and murder of Israeli men, women, and children. It came across as very odd to me. It still comes across as very odd that there are some people who seem more concerned with this nebulous worry of Islamophobia than they do about the very real and barbaric harm that was caused by Hamas. I put that out there just as a to frame this because that's something which it really does frustrate me. To the question around how do we have this conversation better? I don't know is the short answer. The This is a conflict as old as time itself. And when particularly religion is involved and such deep seated cultural hatreds are involved, people are not open to persuasion. Too many people are not open to persuasion. They're not open to being influenced. They're not open to changing their minds. Really, to have a healthy civil discourse, there has to be a bit of leeway in the ideologies of both sides. There needs to at least be some open mindedness to say, I will at least listen to what the other side is saying and then take on board their point of view. I don't have to agree with it, but I at least need to be open enough to hearing it. The challenge, and this goes for just as much Western liberals, Western conservatives, as much as the actual combatants on the ground in the Middle East, is that there is a closed mindedness which makes open, free conversation on this topic impossible. That's a real shame, but I wish I had an intelligent answer for how we can have healthy debates about, say, Middle Eastern conflict, but in an environment where people aren't open to hearing the other side, when there is such hatred, I can't see how we can get to that point, unfortunately.
I understand. Now, moving on to a quote unquote dangerous topic, this time closer to your country of origin, Australia. I understand that less than 2 months ago, January the 26th, you guys celebrated Australia Day. So happy, very belated Australia Day to you, sir.
Thank you.
Um, Now, just as it is the case with Canada Day, so July the 1st, and Columbus Day, which I fail to recall which day it is in the America. Certain people of the more like left-leaning persuasion co-opt this particular day as a um, a remembrance or a reckoning of Western historical colonial past. And for Australians, it is an occasion, so to speak, to remember how the settlers have done the natives or the Aborigines wrong. So uh, tell us how do Australians how can Australians celebrate Australia Day while knowing this history?
It is a thorny topic in Australia. So, January 26 marks the day when the first fleet arrived from England and came to Australia. Some people look at that day as a day of the start of, some people even say a genocide. They look at it as a day of mourning, and particularly a day of mourning with respect to the impact that the first settlers from England had on the Indigenous Aborigines of Australia. There is no doubt that there were some awful, terrible things that happened to the Indigenous Australian population. There was no genocide, but there were nonetheless awful things that happened. There is also no doubt that even up until today, Indigenous living standards, particularly in remote rural parts of Australia, lag well behind the rest of Australia. There is no doubt there are still problems there. All that being said, what this attitude from progressive liberals in Australia to say that we need to either change the date or we need to look back on our history in shame. What it does is a couple of things. Number one, it ignores that Australia is primarily built on a Western cultural tradition. The things that overwhelmingly make Australia great: rule of law, free speech, Western political system that we have, Judeo-Christian values, which I note is distinct from Judaism or Christianity. Judeo-Christian values, these are things that make Australia great. They were brought from the West. Secondly, on balance, and this is something which a lot of people really struggle to do, a cost benefit analysis. On balance, there is no doubt that the arrival of The British to Australia was a good thing for this continent. It brought all manner of technology. It opened us up to the world. It was obviously going to happen at some point in history, and it was better that it happened with the British than pretty much any other European colonial power. What this does is by basically saying that this is some sort of tragedy we need to constantly feel guilty about, it A, makes people just continuously depressed and upset about the history, which I don't think is particularly good. B, I think the uh, it weakens our culture. It weakens the how we should think about ourselves. I don't think it helps Indigenous Australian people today. But more than that, if say we were to change the date of Australia Day, what you notice with the activist class is that there is never an end point. They're never satisfied. If we do change the date, there will be another cause with respect to Indigenous Australians. It could be, say, reparations that we will move on to. So Australia made a formal apology to Indigenous Australians, I think in 2007 or 2008. And we said at the time, well, that can help us move forward. That can help reconciliation. Of course, that didn't happen because then the next cause was, well, moving up to an Indigenous voice to Parliament, which was a referendum we had in Australia quite recently, which didn't pass. Change the date is another thing. We'll never, ever get to a point where as Australians we are united if we just keep this focus on the past, on our history. We keep this focus on ethnicity, which I think I really struggle with, as opposed to looking at everyone as Australians. And if we have this negative, pessimistic view, as opposed to saying that we are the greatest country in the world, our living standards are incredible. You know, everything from the weather, the way of life, the values that we have are wonderful. But we can't seem to accept that because there are so many people who just want to be miserable about terrible things that happened in our past. I think it's an utterly depressing way of living. And I think we need to push back, not just in Australia, but across Western countries to say, of course, bad things happened in history. They happen in every country. That's a part of human nature. But notwithstanding some of the depressing things in our world today, human civilization is at a high point. We are living longer. We are healthier. We are more prosperous than we have ever been. And we need to actually be happy with that. And we need to be positive as opposed to having this black armband view of everything that's happened in our past.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the voice initiative. That's that's going to be one that I will focus on in this question. So in so in the in some detail that you can remember, so what was the voice initiative, and of course, how would you assess it?
So Australia has a written constitution. In order to change that written constitution, you need to have a referendum, which is a compulsory vote for all Australian people. And that passes if you get a majority of people in a majority of states. So over 50% of Australians need to vote yes. And then a majority of states, so 4 out of 6 Australian states also need to be yes. So we had a referendum to put an Indigenous voice to Parliament in the Constitution. So that would have been a Indigenous representative body that could make representations or provide, I guess, guidance or advice to the government on the day on issues that affected Indigenous Australians. The pro-yes side were saying that this is something we need to do in order to improve the quality of life for Indigenous people, which, as I've said, in many remote areas is woeful. And there was also a moral argument to say that this is a way effectively of making good on some of the bad things that have happened in our past. The main argument on the no side was that this is effectively racializing our politics. It is incorporating race into our constitution. It is further dividing us along racial lines because we shouldn't give particular people particular access to elected representatives just because they are of a particular ethnicity. There was a separate argument on the no side, which is there wasn't anything really to suggest that this would have practically beneficial consequences. Referendums are notoriously difficult to pass in Australia. I think only 7 or 8 out of the 40 odd have passed. and this one was no exception. Polls about a year out showed majority support. The coalition opposition parties, which is the Liberal Party and the National Party in Australia. Liberal Party is, by the way, is I guess the equivalent of the Republicans or the Tories in the UK. They formally opposed the Labor Party's voice referendum proposal. As a result of that, and I think as a result of uh, the I think fundamentally the proposal being a pretty poor one, the Australian public resoundingly voted against it, and I think it was about 61 to 39 no to yes. The only other thing I would say, this was another referendum on identity politics that we've seen across the Western world. I would argue in one way, shape, or form, the votes for Brexit, Trump, what we've recently seen in Ireland. There are all these referendums on effectively identity politics, cultural Marxism, call it whatever you want. And what you're seeing is that, similar to Trump, to Brexit, the Australian elite class, pretty much every corporation, the majority of the media, most public institutions swung behind the Yes campaign in the same way that the elite institutions swung behind the opponents of Trump and they swung behind the Remain case in Brexit. And what you saw was this interesting pushback against the elite class by everyday mainstream Australians to say we hate being lectured to. We hate this sort of sense of moral superiority that this elite class has. And I think a big reason why the Yes campaign didn't get up is because people who may have been open to the idea of a voice just got so sick and tired of companies, for example, lecturing them on morality. And again, as we go into the US election in 2024, you're seeing the exact same thing happen in that with respect to Trump and Biden.
Okay. So I think before jumping out to the sort of populism, or at least the populist reaction to elite, finger wagging that you've indicated,
Mm.
leaving aside identity politics and Australian history in regards to the Aborigines, it is still the case that you've mentioned that the Aboriginal population of Australia is economically and perhaps politically disadvantaged. And of course, there are social problems that the Australian Aborigines experience that are associated with this kind of economic and political disadvantage, namely the epidemic of, let's say, alcoholism, or the prevalence of single motherhood, and amongst other things. So what do you believe are some of the practical steps that either the Australian state or the Australian society at large can do to remedy this?
This is precisely the right question to ask. And I think this is what we should have been talking about all along. I think there was so much symbolism in the voice debate that we weren't talking about, well, how do we practically make people's lives better? A couple of nuances, though, that I would add before getting there. I think that you need to separate Indigenous Australians that live in remote communities in largely outback Australia with Indigenous Australians that live in the major cities or urban areas. 80% of Indigenous Australians live in the cities and in urban areas, and 20% live in remote communities. The 80% that live in the cities, their quality of life, life expectancy, economic outcomes are comparable to everyone else. So really, we're not talking about Indigenous Australians as one homogenous group. We're talking about the 20% of Indigenous Australians that live in remote communities. Definitely economic standards and quality of life is lower in those communities. I would also dispute that they are at a political disadvantage. We have the same democratic rights, whether you are a white Australian, whether you are a Chinese Australian immigrant, whether you are Indigenous Australian. Everyone has the same vote. I would disagree with that. In fact, there is an overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians in our parliament compared to the percentage of Indigenous Australians as a total of the Australian population. So I wouldn't frame it as a political disadvantage. Economic disadvantage in remote Indigenous communities, certainly. In terms of how you go about solving that, there are far smarter minds than mine that have struggled to answer this question. And governments for the last 100 years have tried with relatively little success. But I think it comes back to really the overwhelming goal has to be access to education, making sure that people then go to school, and then, moreover, access to economic opportunity in the form of jobs. Now, unfortunately, and this doesn't just apply to remote Indigenous communities, there are less economic opportunities in regional areas than there are in cities. So, if you're in a desert, remote community in the middle of the desert, there aren't many jobs. That's the sad reality. If there aren't many jobs, then people have less of a sense of purpose. You obviously have less money. You have less to do with your time, and that therefore opens up the problems of drugs and crime and all that sort of thing. So this is the challenge. You can either say, well, how do we try and bring economic opportunity to those communities? Easier said than done. Or how can you potentially encourage people to move to areas where there are more economic opportunity? There are particular groups in Australia that are trying to achieve both of those outcomes. But ultimately, until you have kids that are going to school regularly, until you have people that are in stable jobs, then you unfortunately have so many awful flow-on effects that come with a lack of education and a lack of economic opportunity. And that includes domestic violence, it includes sexual abuse of children, it includes crime, all of these things. It all comes back to jobs, but the answer in terms of how you actually get to that point, easier said than done.
Okay, so let's move on to the rise of populism in the Western world. I understand that historically, whenever there is a rise in a populist movement, is due to the fact that the populace, as well as those who believe in their ideals, also believe that there's a distance between the public officials, I suppose, which are democratically elected for the most part in the Western world this time, and the public opinion. So the central essence of democracy is that public officials have to, in some ways, represent the public opinion. But I suppose this current wave of populism that we see stems from the fact that the public officials in which or we as in Australians, Britons, and Americans have elected do not seem to, well, not only represent public opinion, but they do not even care, so to speak, about what the public opinion has to say. Instead, they seem to be besieged by certain interest groups. It used to be business interest groups back in the days of the early 20th century in America, for example, but now they're political interest groups. So as you've mentioned, groups in regards to identities, so racial and gender and sexualities, etc., as well as certain ideas in regards to the environment or foreign policy. So um, tell me more about this gulf between the elite, so to speak, the ruling class, and the public opinion as is happening in Australia.
I think that's well framed. A few thoughts. Number one, I don't think the gap is as big in Australia as it is in the UK and the US, at least not yet. The US, I think it's an awful problem. And you see that if you look at parts of America, in fact, there is one demographic in America where life expectancy is actually decreasing year on year. and that is white, non-college educated men. Uh, and it doesn't seem like there are politicians who are really looking at that demographic. Similarly, in the UK, Brexit was directly a result of people feeling like they'd been left behind. Australia probably overall has less of a wealth gap, more egalitarian society, so there is less of an issue, but that feeling is still there for many people. In terms of the consequences of that, what you are seeing in Australia is a fracturing of our politics uh, and a decline in the support of both major parties. So the uh, the Labor Party, which is the current incumbent government ruling party, used to be a party that supported the working class. So they were born out of the union movement in Australia for most of Australia's history, like the Democrats, like the Labor Party in the UK. They were there effectively as a form of soft socialism to support the working class. What we've seen in Australia, which again is somewhat exported from the rest of the world, is the left-leaning parties have increasingly now moved to this obsession with identity, this obsession with climate, this obsession with what let's call them elite luxury beliefs. And the word luxury, or the term luxury beliefs, is important because they're beliefs that really people who have enough money can afford to worry about, that issues that don't really impact them directly, but potentially have flow-on consequences. So a carbon tax, for example, people who are wealthy can afford to pay a bit extra for goods and services if it has a carbon tax on top. People who are struggling to make ends meet, that stuff really matters. Similarly, if you look at immigration, and Australian immigration, I think, is well above where we can sustainably have it at the moment. If you're in a nice house on Sydney Harbour, that doesn't really make a big difference to you day in, day out. If you're struggling to enter the housing market and you're seeing that housing prices are going up in part as a result of inflated immigration numbers, that stuff really matters to you. So the left side of politics has a lot to answer for in Australia and indeed across the Western world for basically moving away from their traditional working class demographic and towards this sort of, you know, the old term used to be champagne socialists, but cultural, uh, elite cultural beliefs that are disconnected with the mainstream. I think similarly, the right also has questions. Not so much a challenge, but I think in Australia, the right and John Howard, who was one of Australia's great former prime ministers, said that the Liberal Party in Australia was always a broad church. And again, similar to other right of centre political parties. And it was a broad church because it needed to encompass classical liberals and social conservatives. Now, they agree on some key themes and also they disagree on some things, but the Liberal Party needed to house both of them. What we've seen in Australia is that the gap between those two groups has become bigger, and particularly classical liberals have started to look away to other minor parties, to independents, and move away from the Liberal Party. As a result of that, and I'm not sure whether actually long term those two groups can sustainably sit together. It's just particularly when classical liberals are interested in more of those sorts of cultural battlegrounds that the left are now interested in. Very hard to keep those two groups together. So lower support for the two major parties, increase in independence, and generally a fracturing of the traditional political norms that Australia has seen for a long period of time.
I suppose that the two major events of the past, 15 to 20 years that perhaps expanded this gap in understanding between the public at large and the ruling elites, let's just call them that way, is the financial crisis of '08 and '09.
Mm,
And
mm.
the more recent one would be COVID. Um, so I wonder uh, if there is a nationwide reckoning of how Australia, specifically the Australian government, handled the pandemic. What would be your contribution to that discussion?
I was overseas in the UK actually
Mm,
for most of the pandemic, and I looked back aghast at the way my country responded to it. I think the fear that permeated through our politicians, which then was communicated to public. I think the suspicion that Australians looked at each other. I think the lack of reason or rationality behind so many of the policies that were endorsed by governments, for me, was heartbreaking. And it was heartbreaking because so many of the ways that we responded to incredibly harsh lockdown measures, through closing our borders, through dobbing in on fellow Australians if you saw them breaking a particular policy. These are all characteristics that I thought were so foreign to the Australian national identity. Australians throughout history have kind of been known as irreverent, as relaxed, laid back, suspicious of authority, uh, willing to give everyone a fair go. And pretty much each of those characteristics that were traditionally associated with Australians were in diametric opposition to how Australian politicians actually acted in that period. So you asked, how would I respond to the politicians of that time, and what would I say if a reckoning was to emerge? I'd say a couple of things. I'd say number one, we need to refocus on civil liberties and the importance of individual freedoms, because they were very quickly discarded at the first hint of any potential risk to our safety. Now, in the end, I don't think the actual threat of COVID as a disease was anywhere near comparable to the degree to which we for or compromised our civil liberties. The fact that we shut our borders for 2 years was a disgrace. The fact that Melbourne, I believe, had the longest lockdowns of any city in the world was a disgrace. Uh, we need to refocus on the importance of civil liberties, and more people need to get better at making the argument for freedom. But the second thing I would say is, and this goes for Australia and other countries, politicians need to get much better at holistic cost benefit analysis. So, one of the tragedies of COVID was that a simple measure, or a couple of simple measures, daily infection rates and daily death rates, dominated every decision that we made. There was no real consideration of the second order consequences of lockdowns. And we're now seeing those second order consequences, like, for example, other diseases not being treated. So you've seen a huge number of cancer cases rise because they weren't being treated at the time. The stunting of educational development for young people, the social impacts like increased rates of depression and loneliness, and obviously the economic impacts, which in the long run, I think will end up killing more people than COVID ever did. We didn't think about all that stuff. We didn't think how will lockdowns impact all of those second order consequences, because we were just purely focused on the science and daily COVID numbers. So we need to get better, and I think this goes for all Western governments, at thinking about problems holistically as opposed to just fear mongering around a really blunt measure, which is what happened in the COVID period.
Now, you mentioned John Howard earlier. I agree that he is currently the greatest living Australian former and also present Prime Minister. So, how does Prime Minister Howard exemplify Aussie leadership?
It's a very good question. So the thing about Howard, which I think he's probably the last politician in Australia you can say this of, everyone called him a conviction politician. So what they meant by that is, you may like him, you may not like him, but you always know where he stood on a particular issue. And on several issues, he was willing to risk his political hide to to uh, to propose a particular policy or initiative. He did so with guns. So the gun reforms of Australia in 1996 or 97 were a landmark in his prime ministership, and he had to go against a lot of his conservative base who were incredibly unhappy with that. But he had a conviction that it was the right thing to do. Uh, even up until the very end, one of the policies which ultimately led to him losing office was work choices, which was around industrial relations. Probably went a tad too far, but he was a conviction politician. What we now see, and I think, again, this is common to a lot of Western leaders now, is the pursuit of power for power's sake, as opposed to having any real driving ambition or agenda, which is rooted in a belief of this is how I think a society should be organized. I a great example of this is someone like a Rishi Sunak. If you look at him at the moment, you go, what is your point? What is your reason for being? I have absolutely no idea what you stand for. In fact, you could say that about probably the entire period of Tory government in the UK. Uh, and this is reflected across a lot of leaders. There is this pursuit of power for power's sake. I don't think they're as well informed on history, on philosophy, on political science to actually come to a fully formed worldview. And so as a result of that, you just have this kind of ping pong from issue to issue, and nothing ever really substantially gets done, and you don't really know where politicians stand. So the lesson from Howard is we need to have more conviction politicians who actually stand up for what they believe in and are willing to fight, as opposed to, I think, a cowardly political class that is afraid of serious reform because it may impact their poll numbers.
Yes, I do agree that the succession of premiers after Howard, at least in the liberal, as in conservative camp in Australia, resembles that of the lineage of British prime ministers after Brexit, which arguably was a successful endeavor for them. Um, Lots of unremarkable characters. So in the UK, you have that one person who didn't last 3 months, so to speak,
Us.
and
Yeah.
yes, trusts. And in Australia, you have also a succession of unremarkable characters. I guess Turnbull and Abbott and Morrison, the most recent one. I think that failure led to the victory of the Labour camp, which is the left-leaning side, led by one Anthony Albanese. So he's currently sitting in the, I guess, Canberra as we speak, the capital of Australia. So how would you assess the current Albanese administration?
So the coalition government, including those prime ministers that you mentioned, they'd been in power for, it was 11 years, maybe 12 years. Politics is about cycles. They were probably spent anyway. I don't think, on balance, those 11 years were particularly good from a governance perspective. I'm centre right, and so that's something which I would be concerned about. But it was probably time for a change of government, so that was always really going to happen. In terms of the Albanese government, I think it actually suffers from a lot of the problems that we just mentioned. I think there's a lack of conviction. I don't think they really know what they stand for. I think the one thing where he really went out on a limb and put his neck out on was the voice, and it was just completely the wrong thing to do. Public didn't get behind it. It really chewed up an entire year of political capital. We didn't talk about anything else. We weren't talking about practical solutions to problems. We were talking about largely symbolic measures. And since then, Albanese, since that loss, which hit Albanese very hard, I think the government's been a bit wayward. They haven't really known what to focus on, what to prioritise. And it comes back to that tension that I mentioned earlier, in that I think the Labor Party in Australia are very unsure of whether to go all in on their working class roots and their base and focus on bread and butter issues like cost of living, like housing affordability, like helping out the battler, the working class man and woman, or whether they are there to support the inner city elites and to go all in on things like climate change, identity politics, symbolic gesture politics. Because they're kind of stuck in that awkward middle ground, nothing's really getting done. And as a result, there hasn't been any really substantive economic reform in Australia for years and years now. And this is an economy which sorely needs economic reform. And we're not going to get it. And as a result of that, I think, unfortunately, there are pretty dire economic headwinds that we are going to run into throughout the rest of the the 2020s.
Yes, and I suppose the trouble that the Albanese government, the same with every mainstream left-leaning parties and governments across the Western world, is whether they should champion the economically disadvantaged, or uh, should they stick to the interest groups that
Mm,
are, yeah, are minority, but they are very mo vocal minority.
mm.
Okay. Oh, you like to add any?
No, I think you've summed that up well. For what it's worth, I think they very much should just ignore those kind of inner city elites and focus on their traditional working class bases. They're the people who really need the help and support. I think this kind of, for want of a better term, woke progressive class are an awful class. I think the Labour Party and indeed the Democrats and indeed the Labour Party in the UK would be best ignoring them and focusing on people who actually need the help, which are people who are struggling to make ends meet day to day.
Now, I'd like to end on this note, which is perhaps not so related to Australian politics, but related to Australian culture. Um,
Mm.
Last year, a prominent Australian icon, Rolf Harris, passed away. He, I understand, is a big, no, well-known name in Australian pop culture up to a certain point, because um, he faced multiple allegations of sexual misconduct and sex crimes, and he went to jail for some years because of that. So, in your view, to what extent have Australians reckoned with Rolf Harris?
It's an interesting question. I don't. I look. I think. Um, I think every Australian recognised that what he had done and the crimes that he committed were heinous, and everyone was happy to see him go to jail. I don't think it actually particularly scarred the national psyche, because I think everyone very quickly realised that this was not a good person. What I would actually add, maybe a, a more positive character, was Barry Humphries, and
Hmm.
he passed away late last year. And his great alter ego was Dame Edna Everage. And that did really affect a lot of people, because I think Barry Humphries represented the very best of Australia. Wit, again, that sort of suspicion of authority, that irreverent, cheeky sense of humor, and intelligence, uh, and a cheekiness, but a kind-heartedness at the same time. And I think when Barry passed away, a few Australians may have thought that a particular version of Australia passed away with him, and I hope that we can re-embrace the spirit of Dame Edna. I hope we can re-embrace that cheekiness, that irreverence that once characterised Australia, that Australian larrikinism, which is a particular word to describe that Australian part of the Australian psyche. I really hope we can get back there.
Well, long live Barry Humphries. On that note, thank you very much, Will Kingston of the Australiana podcast, for joining this show.
Absolute pleasure, John. Thank you very much.